You're sitting at a dimly lit bar, nursing your drink, when suddenly the temperature drops 20 degrees in seconds. The glass in your hand begins to frost over, and you hear footsteps behind you on the empty wooden floor. You turn around, but there's nobody there. The bartender has vanished, the other patrons have disappeared, and you're completely alone with something that shouldn't exist. Welcome to America's most haunted drinking establishments, where last call might just be your final call. Tonight, we're taking you on a terrifying journey through 10 bars where the spirits serve themselves, where ghostly bartenders still pour drinks for the living, and where closing time means nothing to the restless dead. I'm your host, and over the next hour, you'll discover places so haunted that even skeptics leave as believers. We'll explore bars where Revolutionary War soldiers still drink their ale, where murdered patrons refuse to leave their favorite stools, and where the paranormal activity has been so intense that some establishments have had to close their doors permanently. But here's what makes these stories even more chilling. Every single location we're about to visit is real. Every ghost story has been documented. Every supernatural encounter has been witnessed by multiple people. These are not urban legends passed down through generations. These are active hauntings happening right now, tonight, as you listen to this story. So dim the lights, get comfortable, and prepare yourself for a night you'll never forget. Because once you hear these stories, you might never look at your local bar the same way again. Let's begin our descent into America's most terrifyingly haunted drinking establishments. Our journey begins in the cobblestone streets of Newport, Rhode Island, at a place that has been serving spirits of both kinds for over 3.5 centuries. The White Horse Tavern, established in 1673, holds the distinction of being America's oldest operating tavern. But with age comes something far more sinister than just creaky floorboards and faded paint. The moment you step through the heavy wooden doors of the White Horse Tavern, you're transported back to colonial America. The low-hanging beams, the massive stone fireplace, and the uneven floors all speak to an era when this tavern served as a gathering place for merchants, sailors, and travelers seeking refuge from the harsh New England weather. But among these historical patrons, some have never truly left. The most famous resident spirit is a man locals have dubbed simply the Gentleman. Dressed in colonial-era clothing complete with a tricorn hat and long coat, this apparition has been spotted countless times over the past century. Witnesses describe him as tall and distinguished, with an air of authority that suggests he may have been someone of importance during his living years. He's often seen sitting alone at a corner table, appearing to read documents by candlelight that isn't actually there. What makes the Gentleman's appearances particularly unsettling is his interaction with the living world. Staff members have reported setting tables for the evening service, only to return minutes later to find one specific table completely rearranged. The salt and pepper shakers moved to exact positions, the silverware laid out in a pattern that doesn't match the restaurant standard, and sometimes, most eerily, 2 place settings instead of 4, as if the Gentleman is expecting company that only he can see. But the Gentleman isn't alone in his eternal residence at the White Horse Tavern. The second floor, which once housed weary travelers in small, cramped rooms, is now home to what staff and guests describe as phantom footsteps. These aren't the creaking sounds of an old building settling. These are the distinct sounds of boots walking purposefully across wooden floors, sometimes pacing back and forth for hours during the night. Manager Sarah Chun, who has worked at the tavern for over 15 years, recalls one particularly terrifying evening in November 2019. She was closing alone, a routine she had performed hundreds of times before. As she was completing her final check of the dining rooms, she heard what sounded like a full conversation coming from upstairs. Multiple voices, both male and female, engaged in what seemed to be an animated discussion. Thinking that somehow guests had managed to access the closed second floor, Sarah grabbed her keys and climbed the narrow staircase. The voices grew louder as she approached, clear enough that she could almost make out individual words. But the moment her foot touched the last step, complete silence fell over the building. She searched every room, every closet, every possible hiding place. She was completely alone. The supernatural activity at the White Horse Tavern isn't limited to visual and auditory experiences. The temperature fluctuations throughout the building have baffled HVAC specialists for decades. Certain areas of the tavern will suddenly become freezing cold, sometimes dropping 30 or 40 degrees in a matter of seconds, while the rest of the building remains comfortably warm. These cold spots seem to move throughout the building, following no predictable pattern. One of the most documented incidents occurred during a private wedding reception in October 2018. The bride and groom had specifically requested the oldest section of the tavern for their celebration, drawn to its historical ambience. As the evening progressed and the couple prepared to cut their cake, several guests noticed that their breath had become visible in the air around the wedding table. The temperature had dropped so dramatically that frost began forming on the windows, despite it being a mild autumn evening outside. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of the White Horse Tavern hauntings is what happens in the early morning hours, long after the last patron has gone home and the staff has locked up for the night. Security cameras installed throughout the building have captured footage that defies explanation. Chairs moving on their own, seemingly pulled out from tables as if someone is sitting down. Doors opening and closing with no visible cause. And most disturbing of all, shadows moving across walls when there's nothing there to cast them. The local paranormal investigation team, Rhode Island Spirits, has conducted multiple investigations at the White Horse Tavern over the past decade. Lead investigator Michael Torres describes the location as one of the most actively haunted places he's ever encountered. During their most recent investigation in September 2023, the team recorded over 40 separate incidents of unexplained phenomena in just 6 hours. Wait, did you hear that? That sound like glass breaking? Oh, it's probably just the old building settling. Or is it? Because at the White Horse Tavern, you can never be quite sure what's real and what's from beyond the grave. But our journey is just beginning, and trust me, what we discover next will make the gentleman seem like a friendly neighbor. If the White Horse Tavern introduced us to genteel colonial spirits, our next destination plunges us into the heart of America's most notorious haunted city, where the line between the living and the dead has always been razor thin. Deep in the French Quarter of New Orleans, at 1140 Royal Street, stands a 3-story mansion that has become synonymous with unspeakable horror and supernatural torment. The LaLaurie Mansion, now operating as an upscale cocktail lounge, carries with it a history so dark and disturbing that even seasoned paranormal investigators hesitate before crossing its threshold. Built in the 1830s, this elegant Creole mansion was once the home of Madame Marie Delphine LaLaurie, a New Orleans socialite whose name would become forever linked with torture, murder, and the kind of evil that leaves permanent scars on the very walls of a building. On April 10, 1834, a fire broke out in the mansion's kitchen. When firefighters and neighbors rushed to help, they made a discovery so horrific that it shocked even the violence-hardened residents of antebellum New Orleans. In the mansion's attic, they found evidence of systematic torture and murder. Enslaved people had been chained, mutilated, and subjected to medical experiments so barbaric that many of the rescuers became physically ill. Madame LaLaurie fled the city that very night, but the evil she had perpetrated seemed to seep into the very foundation of the building. The mansion changed hands multiple times over the following decades, but no owner could remain for long. Reports of screaming, chains rattling, and the sounds of suffering echoed through the halls long after the last victim had been laid to rest. Today, the building operates as an exclusive bar, but the supernatural activity has not diminished with time. If anything, it has intensified. The current owner, who requested anonymity for this story, estimates that they've had to replace their entire staff at least 6 times in the past 3 years. Not because of poor working conditions or low pay, but because employees simply cannot handle the psychological trauma of working in a building where the dead refuse to rest. Bartender Marcus Williams worked at the LaLaurie Mansion Bar for exactly 17 days before he quit without notice. His experience, which he shared with us on condition that we not reveal his current location, provides a glimpse into the daily horror faced by those who work within these cursed walls. Marcus's first indication that something was seriously wrong came during his second shift. He was alone in the bar area, preparing for the evening service, when he heard what sounded like sobbing coming from the basement storage area. The crying was so heart-wrenching, so filled with despair, that Marcus felt compelled to investigate. He grabbed a flashlight and descended the narrow stairs into the basement. The sobbing grew louder as he approached the back corner of the storage area, where cases of wine and spirits were stacked floor to ceiling. But as Marcus rounded the corner, flashlight beam dancing across the walls, the crying stopped abruptly. In the sudden silence, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The temperature in that specific corner was at least 20 degrees colder than the rest of the basement, and his flashlight beam seemed to be absorbed by the darkness, barely illuminating a few feet in front of him. As Marcus stood frozen in the unnatural cold, he heard something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Chains. The distinct sound of heavy metal chains dragging across stone floor. The sound seemed to circle around him, moving from wall to wall, but his flashlight revealed nothing but empty space. The supernatural encounters at the LaLaurie Mansion Bar aren't limited to sounds and temperature changes. Patrons regularly report seeing apparitions throughout the building. The most commonly cited spirit is that of a young woman, believed to be one of Madame LaLaurie's victims, who appears on the main staircase leading to the second floor. Witnesses describe her as wearing a tattered white dress, her hands extended as if pleading for help, her mouth open in a silent scream. But it's what happens to the alcohol that truly sets the LaLaurie Mansion Bar apart from other haunted establishments. Bottles of spirits, particularly rum and whiskey, have been found completely empty despite being full when inventory was taken the night before. Security cameras show no evidence of theft or consumption, yet the bottles are drained dry. Staff members have theorized that the spirits of the dead are literally consuming the spirits on the shelves, finding some comfort in alcohol that they were denied in life. The most terrifying incidents at the LaLaurie Mansion Bar occur in the upstairs private dining areas, the same rooms where Madame LaLaurie once entertained New Orleans society while committing atrocities in her attic. Guests who book these exclusive spaces often leave before their meals arrive, claiming they feel watched, judged, or threatened by invisible presences. One such incident occurred during a corporate event in March 2022. A group of lawyers had reserved the second-floor dining room for a celebration dinner. As the evening progressed, several members of the party began complaining of feeling nauseous and dizzy. The room grew progressively colder despite the building's heating system working perfectly in other areas. Then the scratching began. At first, it sounded like mice in the walls, but it grew louder and more deliberate. Long, slow scratches that seemed to form patterns on the inside of the walls. One of the lawyers, a woman who had remained skeptical throughout the evening, stood up to investigate the source of the sound. As she approached the wall, the scratching stopped, and in the sudden silence, she heard her own name whispered directly into her ear. The entire party fled the building immediately, leaving their meals untouched and their bill unpaid. But here's what makes the LaLaurie Mansion Bar truly unique among America's haunted establishments, and this might surprise you. Despite the overwhelming supernatural activity, despite the terror experienced by staff and patrons alike, despite the building's horrific history, there's a waiting list for reservations that stretches months into the future. People come here specifically because of the ghosts, drawn by some morbid fascination with communing with the dead. The question isn't whether the LaLaurie Mansion Bar is haunted. The question is whether some places become so saturated with human suffering that they become doorways to something far worse than simple ghost stories. And speaking of doorways, our next destination takes us to a place where the door between worlds doesn't just occasionally open. It was blown completely off its hinges decades ago. Just across the Ohio River from Cincinnati, in the small town of Wildest, Kentucky, stands a building that paranormal investigators consider to be the most haunted nightclub in America. Bobby Mackey's Music World, a honky-tonk bar and music venue, sits atop what many believe to be a literal gateway to hell. And before you dismiss that as hyperbole, consider this. The building has been the subject of multiple exorcisms, countless paranormal investigations, and has driven both employees and patrons to the brink of madness. The history of this cursed location stretches back to the 1890s, long before Bobby Mackey ever dreamed of owning a music venue. The land once housed a slaughterhouse, where thousands of animals met their end in conditions so brutal that the very soil became saturated with blood and death. But the slaughterhouse was just the beginning of this location's dark legacy. In the 1920s, during the height of Prohibition, the building was converted into a speakeasy called the Primrose. It was here that the supernatural activity truly began to manifest, coinciding with two murders that would forever link this location to violence and tragedy. Pearl Bryan, a young woman from Indiana, was brutally murdered by her lover and his accomplice in 1896. Her head was never found, and local legend claims it was used in occult rituals performed in the building's basement. The second murder occurred decades later, but within the same walls. In 1955, a dancer named Johanna was gunned down by her gangster boyfriend in what was then called the Latin Quarter nightclub. Her death was particularly brutal, and witnesses reported that her final words were a curse upon the building and everyone who would ever set foot inside. Bobby Mackey purchased the building in 1978, intending to create a country music venue where he could showcase local talent and provide entertainment for the community. He had no idea he was about to become the reluctant curator of America's most active supernatural hotspot. The paranormal activity at Bobby Mackey's Music World defies classification. It's not just ghost sightings or unexplained sounds. The supernatural occurrences here are physical, violent, and deeply personal. Employees and patrons don't just see ghosts, they're attacked by them. They don't just hear unexplained noises. They're spoken to by entities that know intimate details about their lives. Carl Lawson, who worked as a caretaker at Bobby Mackey's for over 2 decades, became the unwilling focal point for much of the supernatural activity. Carl didn't just work at the club, he lived there, residing in an apartment above the main floor. This arrangement gave him a front-row seat to phenomena that would have driven most people to flee in terror. Carl's experiences began almost immediately after he started working at the club. He would arrive in the morning to find furniture moved, lights turned on in rooms he knew had been dark when he left, and most disturbing of all, the jukebox playing music despite being unplugged from the wall. The jukebox, a vintage Wurlitzer that had been in the building since the 1950s, seemed to have developed a mind of its own. But it was Carl's relationship with the spirit he called Johanna that truly demonstrated the personal nature of the hauntings at Bobby Mackey's. Carl claimed that Johanna, the murdered dancer from 1955, had formed an attachment to him that went beyond typical paranormal encounters. She would appear to him regularly, sometimes as a full apparition, sometimes as just a voice, always trying to communicate something urgent. According to Carl, Johanna warned him about other, more malevolent entities in the building. She spoke of demons in the basement, of rituals that had opened doorways that should never have been opened, and of a growing supernatural presence that fed on the energy of the living. Carl's accounts were initially dismissed as the fantasies of a lonely man living in isolation, until other employees began experiencing similar encounters. The basement of Bobby Mackey's music world has become legendary among paranormal investigators. It's here that the building's dark history seems to be concentrated, where the slaughterhouse's blood-soaked foundation meets the occult practices of later decades. The basement contains what appears to be a well, though nobody knows exactly how deep it goes or what purpose it originally served. Paranormal investigator Ryan Buell, who featured Bobby Mackey's on his television series Paranormal State, described the basement as having an almost oppressive spiritual presence. During filming, multiple crew members reported feeling physically ill, experiencing sudden temperature drops, and hearing voices speaking in languages they couldn't identify. The most documented paranormal incident at Bobby Mackey's occurred during a private investigation in October 2008. A team of paranormal researchers, equipped with multiple cameras and recording devices, spent 3 nights in the building. On the second night, while investigating the basement area, one of the researchers was physically attacked by an unseen force. The attack was captured on multiple camera angles. The researcher, a man in his 30s who had been investigating paranormal claims for over a decade, was standing near the well when he suddenly screamed and fell backward. When his teammates rushed to help him, they found 3 long scratches across his back, cuts that had torn through both his shirt and the skin beneath. But here's what makes this incident particularly significant. The scratches weren't random. They formed a specific pattern, 3 parallel lines that matched scratches found on other investigators at different times in different locations throughout the building. It was as if something in Bobby Mackey's was marking people, claiming them in some way. The supernatural activity at Bobby Mackey's isn't limited to investigators and employees. Patrons of the music venue regularly report encounters that range from unsettling to terrifying. Women visiting the restroom often report feeling watched, seeing movement in mirrors when no one else is present, and hearing their names whispered by voices they don't recognize. The main floor of the club, where live music is performed several nights a week, has its own supernatural quirks. Musicians have reported that their instruments will go out of tune during performances, sometimes in the middle of songs. Sound equipment malfunctions with no apparent cause, and several performers have claimed to see audience members who aren't actually there. One country music performer, who requested anonymity, described an experience that ended his career at Bobby Mackey's permanently. During a Saturday night show in June 2019, he was performing a slow ballad when he noticed a woman in 1950s-era clothing standing alone near the back of the club. She seemed to be crying, and something about her appearance struck him as anachronistic even for a venue that celebrated vintage Americana. As he continued performing, the woman began moving closer to the stage. With each step, the temperature in the club seemed to drop, and other patrons began moving away from her without seeming to realize why. When she reached the edge of the stage, she looked directly at the performer and mouthed a single word: "Help." The performer stopped mid-song, unable to continue. When he looked back to where the woman had been standing, she was gone. Later, when he described the woman to Bobby Mackey, the owner immediately knew who he had seen. Johanna, the murdered dancer, still seeking justice after all these decades. You know what's really unsettling about Bobby Mackey's music world? It's not just that it's haunted. It's that the hauntings seem to be getting stronger, more violent, more personal with each passing year, as if whatever opened that doorway to hell is still widening it, still pulling more darkness into our world. But our journey through America's most haunted bars is far from over, and our next destination will show us that sometimes the most innocent-looking places hide the darkest secrets. High in the Colorado Rockies, surrounded by peaks that scrape the sky and forests that whisper ancient secrets, sits a grand hotel that inspired one of the most terrifying novels ever written. The Stanley Hotel, with its gleaming white facade and elegant colonial revival architecture, looks like the perfect mountain retreat. But beneath its pristine exterior lies a supernatural legacy that has made it a pilgrimage site for horror enthusiasts worldwide. The Stanley Hotel's whiskey bar didn't gain its reputation through centuries of accumulated spirits like our previous destinations. Instead, it became haunted through a single transformative event that would change not just the building, but the entire landscape of American horror fiction. In 1974, a struggling writer named Stephen King checked into room 217 for what he thought would be a quiet retreat to work on his latest project. What King experienced during his stay at the Stanley would become the foundation for his novel The Shining, but the real hauntings that inspired his fictional masterpiece continue to this day, concentrated most intensely in the hotel's elegant whiskey bar. The paranormal activity at the Stanley's whiskey bar centers around what staff and guests have dubbed the Eternal Party. Unlike other haunted establishments where spirits seem tormented or seeking resolution, the ghosts at the Stanley appear to be perpetually celebrating, as if death was merely an inconvenience that interrupted their revelry rather than an ending. The phenomenon manifests most clearly during the late evening hours, long after the bar has closed and the last patron has retired to their room. Security guards making their rounds report hearing the distinct sounds of a party in full swing. Laughter, conversation, the clinking of glasses, and even piano music echoing through the empty bar area. James Patterson, who worked as night security at the Stanley for 8 years, describes the experience as both beautiful and deeply unsettling. According to James, the Phantom Party follows a predictable schedule. It begins around 11:30 p.m. with the sound of people entering the bar, chairs being pulled out from tables, and general conversation. By midnight, the party reaches full swing, with what sounds like dozens of people engaged in animated discussion, punctuated by frequent bursts of laughter. But here's what makes the Eternal Party particularly eerie. The conversations, while clearly audible, seem to be taking place in multiple time periods simultaneously. James reported hearing discussions about topics spanning from the 1920s to the present day, as if different generations of spirits were all celebrating together, separated by decades in life but united in death. The piano music that accompanies the Eternal Party has been traced to a specific instrument, a 1909 Steinway grand piano that sits in the corner of the whiskey bar. The piano, which was original to the hotel and has been maintained in perfect playing condition, often plays by itself during these supernatural gatherings. But it doesn't just produce random notes. The phantom pianist performs complete songs, complex classical pieces, and popular tunes from different eras. Hotel guest Maria Gonzalez captured audio of the phantom piano during her stay in March 2023. Maria, a professional musician herself, was unable to sleep due to what she initially thought was a late-night party in the bar below her room. When she called the front desk to complain, she was informed that the bar had been closed for hours and the building was empty except for security staff. Intrigued rather than annoyed, Maria grabbed her phone and recorded 15 minutes of the phantom performance. The recording, which has since been analyzed by audio experts, clearly captures a skilled pianist performing Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, followed by several ragtime pieces popular in the early 1900s, and concluding with The Way You Look Tonight, a song that wouldn't be written until decades after the Stanley first opened. The visual manifestations in the Stanley's whiskey bar are as impressive as the auditory phenomena. Staff members routinely report seeing well-dressed figures from different historical periods mingling throughout the bar area. These apparitions don't seem to be replaying past events, but rather actively participating in an ongoing supernatural social gathering. Bartender Sarah Kim, who has worked at the Stanley for 5 years, describes the spirits as generally benevolent but occasionally mischievous. During her evening closing routine, Sarah often finds evidence of the Phantom Party's activities. chairs arranged in conversation circles that she had stacked on tables, wine glasses that appear to have been used despite being clean when she left them, and most remarkably, bar tabs written in elegant handwriting on paper that matches stationery used by the hotel in the 1920s. The supernatural patrons of the whiskey bar seem particularly drawn to living guests who appreciate the hotel's history and show respect for its ghostly residents. Several visitors have reported being approached by well-dressed figures who engage them in conversation about the hotel's past, sharing details about events and people that can later be verified through historical records. One of the most documented encounters occurred during a paranormal investigation conducted by the Colorado Paranormal Society in September 2022. Lead investigator Dr. Rebecca Torres was setting up recording equipment in the whiskey bar when she was approached by a woman in 1920s evening, who introduced herself as Eleanor Fitzgerald. Eleanor, speaking in the precise diction of the Jazz Age, explained that she had been a frequent guest at the Stanley during the 1920s and 1930s, often staying for weeks at a time during the summer season. She described parties in the whiskey bar that lasted until dawn, featuring musicians and celebrities who came to the Stanley to escape the pressures of their public lives. What made this encounter particularly significant was Eleanor's knowledge of specific historical details about the Stanley that weren't widely known. She mentioned renovations that had been done to the bar area in 1928, described the original color scheme of the walls, and even knew the names of staff members who had worked at the hotel during her supposed lifetime. Dr. Torres later researched Eleanor's claims and found them to be historically accurate down to minute details. Hotel records from the 1920s confirmed that a woman named Eleanor Fitzgerald had indeed been a regular guest, staying at the Stanley for extended periods during the summer months between 1923 and 1938. But the Stanley's whiskey bar holds secrets that go beyond ghostly parties and phantom pianists. In the basement storage areas beneath the bar, staff members have discovered evidence of supernatural activity that predates the hotel's construction. The basement contains natural cave formations that were incorporated into the building's foundation, and these caves seem to harbor something far older and more mysterious than the elegant spirits who populate the bar above. Maintenance workers report finding strange symbols carved into the cave walls, symbols that don't match any known Native American petroglyphs from the region. The symbols appear to be relatively recent, carved sometime after the hotel's construction, but their meaning remains unknown. More disturbing are reports of voices speaking in unknown languages echoing through the cave system, voices that seem to respond to the phantom parties happening in the bar above. The most unsettling aspect of the Stanley's supernatural activity is its apparent intelligence and organization. Unlike random hauntings or residual energy replaying past events, the spirits at the whiskey bar seem to be actively aware of the living world and capable of adapting their behavior based on current events. During the COVID-19 pandemic, when the Stanley was closed to guests for several months, security cameras captured footage of the phantom party continuing to meet in the whiskey bar. But the spirits appeared to be following social distancing guidelines, with ghostly figures seated farther apart than usual and what appeared to be spectral face masks visible on some of the apparitions. This adaptive behavior suggests that the hauntings at the Stanley aren't just echoes of the past, but rather indicate the presence of conscious entities who are aware of and responding to the modern world. It raises questions about the nature of consciousness after death and whether some spirits are capable of growth and change even in their supernatural state. The Stanley Hotel's whiskey bar represents a unique type of haunting, one where the living and the dead coexist in an almost symbiotic relationship. The spirits seem to draw energy from the living guests, while the living visitors are enriched by their encounters with history made manifest. But not all of America's haunted bars are populated by such genteel spirits. Some harbors entities that are far less welcoming to the living, and our next destination will show us that sometimes the most innocent-looking places hide the darkest secrets. In the heart of the Wild West, where legends were born and outlaws met their fate, stands a building that witnessed more violence, debauchery, and sudden death than perhaps any other structure in American history. The Birdcage Theater in Tombstone, Arizona, operated for just 8 years, from 1881 to 1889, but in that brief time it became known as the wickedest, wildest, most dangerous honky-tonk between Basin Street and the Barbary Coast. Today, the Birdcage operates as a museum and bar, serving spirits both liquid and supernatural to visitors brave enough to enter what the Tombstone epitaph once called the roughest, bawdiest, most wicked night spot in the world. But the spirits who refuse to leave this place aren't the genteel partygoers we encountered at the Stanley Hotel. These are the restless souls of gunfighters, gamblers, prostitutes, and desperados who met violent ends within these walls. The Birdcage earned its notorious reputation honestly. During its 8 years of operation, the building hosted ongoing poker games that ran 24 hours a day for 8 years straight. The stakes were high, tempers ran hotter, and disputes were settled with lead rather than lawsuits. By the time the silver boom ended and the Birdcage finally closed its doors, the building bore 140 bullet holes in its walls and ceiling, testament to the violence that was as common as whiskey and cards. The supernatural activity at the Birdcage Theater defies easy categorization because it encompasses so many different types of paranormal phenomena occurring simultaneously. Unlike other haunted locations where specific spirits dominate the supernatural landscape, the Birdcage is home to what paranormal investigators describe as a supernatural ecosystem, with dozens of different entities coexisting in various states of unrest. The most frequently encountered spirit is that of a woman known only as Margarita, one of the many soiled doves who worked the Birdcage during its heyday. Margarita met her end in 1882, stabbed to death by a jealous customer who discovered her with another man. Her death was brutal and swift, but her presence in the Birdcage has endured for over a century. Visitors to the Birdcage's bar area regularly report encounters with Margarita, who appears as a woman in her 20s wearing a red dress typical of the 1880s. Unlike many spirits who seem oblivious to the living world, Margarita actively interacts with visitors, particularly men who are alone or who show interest in the building's history. Tom Harrison, a paranormal investigator who has spent countless hours researching the Birdcage, describes Margarita as flirtatious but protective. She seems drawn to men who visit the bar area, often appearing beside them as they examine historical artifacts or read about the building's past. Several visitors have reported feeling a hand on their shoulder, turning to find no one there, but catching the scent of rose perfume that was popular in the 1880s. But Margarita's interactions can turn jealous and possessive if the men she's drawn to are accompanied by women. Female visitors to the Birdcage frequently report feeling unwelcome in certain areas of the building, experiencing sudden temperature drops, or feeling as if they're being watched with hostility. Some women have reported being physically pushed or having their hair pulled by invisible hands when they enter areas that Margarita seems to consider her territory. The bar area of the Birdcage is also home to the spirit of a gambler known as Jake, whose full name has been lost to history, but whose presence is unmistakable. Jake was shot and killed during a poker game in 1884, dying instantly when a dispute over marked cards escalated to gunplay. His spirit seems to be eternally focused on that final, fatal game. Visitors who sit at the poker table where Jake met his end report a variety of supernatural experiences. Cards that were carefully arranged will be found scattered across the table moments later. Poker chips stack themselves in neat piles despite no one touching them. Most unsettling of all, some visitors report hearing a voice whispering in their ear, offering gambling advice or warning them about other players who aren't actually there. During a paranormal investigation in 2019, researchers set up a poker game using period-appropriate cards and chips to see if they could trigger interaction with Jake's spirit. Within minutes of beginning their game, the investigators reported feeling a presence join them at the table. The temperature around the poker table dropped 15 degrees, and sensitive electromagnetic field detectors showed readings consistent with a large object moving around the table's perimeter. One investigator, Dr. Amanda Wright, reported feeling someone sit down in the empty chair beside her, the chair visibly depressed as if supporting weight, and she could hear the distinct sound of chips being shuffled, though no physical chips were moving. When Dr. Wright asked if Jake wanted to join their game, a clear male voice responded through their digital audio recorder with a single word: deal. The upstairs area of the bird cage, which once housed private cribs where the working girls entertained their customers, is perhaps the most actively haunted section of the building. This area, now closed to casual visitors due to safety concerns and intense paranormal activity, was the site of numerous violent deaths during the building's operational years. The supernatural phenomena in the upstairs cribs include full-body apparitions, disembodied voices speaking in multiple languages, and what appears to be the recreation of violent events from the building's past. Security cameras have captured footage of doors opening and closing on their own, shadows moving across walls when no one is present to cast them, and most disturbing of all, what appears to be struggle taking place in empty rooms. One particular crib, known as Room 7, has become legendary among paranormal researchers for the intensity of its supernatural activity. This small room, barely large enough for a bed and washstand, was the site of at least 3 documented murders during the 1880s. Today, sensitive individuals who enter Room 7 report experiencing what psychologists term place memory, vivid sensations and emotions that seem to be imprinted on the location itself. Psychic investigator Maria Santos spent 30 minutes alone in Room 7 during a 2020 investigation. Her experience, recorded on multiple camera angles and audio devices, provides insight into the traumatic history that continues to play out in supernatural form. Maria reported feeling overwhelming fear and desperation, emotions so intense that she began weeping uncontrollably despite having no conscious reason for the emotional response. As the minutes passed, Maria began describing scenes that seemed to be unfolding around her in real time. She spoke of a young woman cowering in the corner, pleading for her life as a man in a dark coat advanced toward her with a knife. Maria could smell gunpowder, hear the sounds of a struggle, and feel the victim's terror as if it were her own. Most remarkably, Maria's descriptions matched historical accounts of murders that had taken place in Room 7, accounts that she claimed to have no previous knowledge of. Her ability to describe specific details about the victims, their clothing, and even their final words suggested that she was somehow accessing the traumatic memories embedded in the room itself. The basement of the Bird Cage Theater presents yet another dimension to the building's supernatural complexity. This underground area, which served as storage and housed the building's wine cellar, has become a focal point for paranormal activity that differs significantly from the spirits found elsewhere in the building. Unlike the human spirits that populate the bar and upstairs areas, the basement seems to harbor something altogether more ancient and malevolent. Visitors to the basement report feeling an overwhelming sense of dread that has no apparent source. The temperature in the basement remains consistently cold, even during Arizona's scorching summer months, and sensitive individuals often report feeling physically ill when they spend extended time in the underground area. The most disturbing aspect of the basement hauntings is the presence of what investigators describe as shadow people, dark humanoid figures that seem to exist at the periphery of vision. These entities don't appear to be the spirits of people who died in the birdcage, but rather something that was drawn to the location by the violence and negative energy that saturated the building during its operational years. During a 2021 investigation, paranormal researcher David Sean captured thermal imaging footage of the basement that shows several human-shaped cold spots moving through the area despite no living people being present. The cold spots moved with purpose and intelligence, seeming to avoid the areas where investigators were working while clustering around certain sections of the basement that show no obvious significance. What makes the Bird Cage Theater unique among America's haunted bars is the sheer variety and intensity of its supernatural residents. This isn't a location with one or two notable spirits, but rather an entire community of the dead who seem to have recreated the social dynamics of 1880s Tombstone in supernatural form. The interactions between different spirits within the birdcage create a complex paranormal environment where territorial disputes, romantic jealousies, and old grievances continue to play out more than a century after the participants' deaths. Visitors often report sensing tension between different areas of the building, as if various spirits are competing for attention or defending their particular territories. But here's what makes the Bird Cage Theater truly terrifying. The spirits here don't just interact with the living world occasionally or on special anniversaries. They're active every single day, every single night, creating an environment where the boundary between past and present has completely dissolved. You might be wondering why anyone would choose to visit such an intensely haunted location. The answer lies in the addictive nature of genuine supernatural encounters. Once someone experiences authentic paranormal activity, once they come face to face with undeniable proof that consciousness survives death, they're forever changed. And the Bird Cage Theater offers some of the most compelling evidence of life after death found anywhere in America. Our next destination takes us from the Wild West to the industrial Northeast, where a different kind of violence created a different kind of haunting. From the lawless frontier town of Tombstone, our journey now takes us to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where the concepts of justice, punishment, and human suffering took on entirely new meanings within the walls of Eastern State Penitentiary. This revolutionary prison, which operated from 1829 to 1971, was designed to break the human spirit through complete isolation, and the psychological torture inflicted within its walls created supernatural scars that continue to bleed into our world today. Eastern State Penitentiary was the first true penitentiary in the world, designed around the radical concept that complete solitary confinement would lead criminals to penitence and rehabilitation. Instead, it drove thousands of inmates to madness, suicide, and despair so profound that it seems to have permanently stained the very stones of the building. Today, a portion of the former prison operates as a museum and event space, including a bar area that was once the prison's administrative offices. But the spirits of Eastern State weren't confined by their death any more than they were rehabilitated by their imprisonment. They roam freely through the complex, carrying with them the accumulated anguish of 142 years of human suffering. The supernatural activity at Eastern State Penitentiary's bar area is fundamentally different from the other haunted establishments we visited. While places like the Bird Cage Theater are haunted by individuals who live dramatic, violent lives, Eastern State is haunted by the collective despair of thousands of forgotten souls who were systematically broken by an institution designed to destroy their humanity. The bar, located in what was once the prison's administrative wing, seems to serve as a gathering place for spirits seeking some form of social contact that was denied to them in life. The phantom patrons of Eastern State's bar aren't celebrating or reliving happier times. Instead, they appear to be desperately seeking the human connection that solitary confinement stole from them. Michael Torres, a former guard who worked at Eastern State during the final years of its operation as a prison, now serves as a tour guide and has witnessed the transformation of the institution from active prison to supernatural hotspot. According to Michael, the psychological trauma inflicted on inmates during the prison's 142-year operation created a psychic residue that continues to manifest as paranormal activity. The most commonly reported phenomenon in Eastern State's bar area is the sound of crying. Not the dramatic sobbing that might be expected in such a tragic location, but rather the quiet, hopeless weeping of people who have given up on ever being heard. This crying seems to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, echoing through the bar area at all hours of the day and night. Visitors often report feeling an overwhelming sadness when they enter the bar, an emotional weight that has no apparent source but feels deeply personal. Some guests have found themselves crying without understanding why, while others experience a profound sense of loss for people they never knew and events they never experienced. The bar's most active supernatural resident is believed to be the spirit of William McCarthy, an inmate who spent 37 years in solitary confinement at Eastern State before taking his own life in 1924. McCarthy's crime had been relatively minor, a robbery that netted less than $50. But the primitive legal system of the early 1900s sentenced him to what amounted to a living death. William's spirit seems particularly drawn to visitors who sit alone at the bar, perhaps recognizing kindred souls who understand isolation. Bartender Jessica Chun, who has worked at Eastern State for 3 years, describes William as a persistent but gentle presence who seems desperate for acknowledgement. According to Jessica, William manifests most commonly as a feeling of someone sitting down at the bar beside lone patrons. The bar stool will shift slightly as if supporting weight, and sensitive individuals often report feeling watched by someone with profound sadness. Some visitors have reported hearing a voice whispering their name, followed by a simple plea, "Don't leave me alone." The most documented supernatural incident at Eastern State's bar occurred during a private event in October 2022. A corporate group had rented the space for a Halloween party, drawn by the authentic atmosphere of the historic prison. As the evening progressed and alcohol flowed freely, the party atmosphere began to shift into something more somber. Several guests reported feeling watched by invisible presences, and the temperature in the bar area dropped noticeably despite the heating system working perfectly. Then the crying began. At first, just 1 or 2 guests thought they heard weeping, but soon the entire party could hear the unmistakable sound of multiple people crying in anguish. The crying wasn't coming from any identifiable source. It seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, growing louder and more desperate as the minutes passed. Several party guests became visibly distressed, with some breaking down in tears themselves despite having no conscious reason for their emotional response. The event organizer, attempting to restore the party atmosphere, turned up the music and encouraged guests to continue celebrating. But as the volume increased, so did the crying, until the supernatural sobbing drowned out the party music entirely. The entire group fled the building, leaving their event half-finished and their deposits forfeited. But Eastern State's supernatural activity extends far beyond the bar area. The prison's cell blocks, which once housed thousands of inmates in conditions that would be considered torture by modern standards, are now home to some of the most intense paranormal activity documented anywhere in America. Cell Block 12, which was abandoned even during the prison's active years due to unexplained disturbances, has become legendary among paranormal investigators. The cell block, which housed inmates who had been driven insane by their confinement, seems to retain the psychological trauma of its former occupants. Investigators who spend time in Cell Block 12 often report experiencing symptoms similar to those described by inmates who suffered mental breakdowns during their imprisonment. These symptoms include auditory hallucinations, feelings of being watched, and most disturbing of all, the sensation of invisible hands touching or grabbing them. Dr. Sarah Williams, a psychiatrist who has studied the psychological effects of solitary confinement, spent a night in Cell Block 12 as part of a research project on environmental psychology. Her experience, documented through audio and video recording, provides insight into how the trauma of the past continues to affect the present. Within hours of entering the cell block, Dr. Williams began reporting auditory hallucinations. She could hear voices coming from empty cells, conversations between inmates who had died decades earlier. The voices weren't threatening or malevolent, but rather seemed to be seeking contact with anyone who would listen. As the night progressed, Dr. Williams began experiencing visual hallucinations as well. She reported seeing figures moving through the cell block, inmates shuffling from cell to cell as if going about their daily routines despite the fact that the prison had been closed for over 50 years. Most remarkably, Dr. Williams began exhibiting behavioral changes consistent with long-term solitary confinement. She started pacing in her cell, talking to herself, and showing signs of the psychological deterioration that Eastern State was designed to produce in its inmates. The changes were temporary, disappearing once she left the cell block, but the experience demonstrated the power of place to influence human psychology even across the barriers of time and death. The supernatural phenomena at Eastern State Penitentiary suggest that extreme psychological trauma can create paranormal hotspots that continue to affect the living long after the original victims have died. The prison seems to function as a psychic battery, storing the accumulated anguish of thousands of inmates and releasing it in ways that continue to traumatize visitors decades after the institution closed. What makes Eastern State particularly unsettling is the nature of the suffering that occurred within its walls. Unlike the violent deaths that haunt places like the Birdcage Theater, the trauma at Eastern State was systematic, prolonged, and designed to break the human spirit completely. This methodical destruction of human dignity seems to have created supernatural scars that are deeper and more persistent than those caused by sudden violence. The spirits at Eastern State don't seek revenge or justice. They simply seek acknowledgement, contact, and the basic human dignity that was denied to them in life. Their supernatural manifestations aren't acts of aggression, but rather desperate attempts to connect with the living world that abandoned them to their suffering. But sometimes the most innocent-looking places hide the darkest secrets, and our next destination will take us to a location where wholesome family dining masks a supernatural presence that defies all explanation. Leaving behind the institutional horrors of Eastern State Penitentiary, our journey takes us west to sunny Southern California, where Victorian elegance and family values created what many consider to be the most authentically haunted house in America. The Whaley House in Old Town San Diego appears to be nothing more than a beautifully preserved example of 1850s architecture. But beneath its charming exterior lies a supernatural complexity that has baffled investigators for over a century. Built in 1857 by Thomas Whaley, a New York entrepreneur who came to California during the Gold Rush, the Whaley House served multiple purposes throughout its history. It was simultaneously the family's private residence, San Diego's first commercial theater, a general store, a ballroom, and during various periods, a courthouse and government office building. Today, a portion of the house operates as a museum with a small bar area that serves period-appropriate refreshments to visitors. What makes the Whaley House unique among America's haunted locations is that it was built on land with a dark history that predates the house itself. The property had previously served as San Diego's public execution site, where criminals were hanged from a large pepper tree that stood in what would later become the house's backyard. The most notable execution was that of James Robinson, known as Yankee Jim, who was hanged in 1852 for stealing a boat. Thomas Whaley was apparently undeterred by the property's grim history, perhaps viewing it as an opportunity to purchase prime real estate at a reduced price. However, from the moment the Whaley family moved into their new home, they were plagued by supernatural disturbances that would continue for generations. The paranormal activity in the Whaley House is notable for its domestic nature. Unlike the tormented spirits we've encountered in other locations, the ghosts of the Whaley House seem to be going about their daily lives as if death was merely an inconvenience rather than an ending. The spirits appear to be attempting to maintain the social norms and family dynamics that define their earthly existence. The most frequently encountered spirit is that of Thomas Whaley himself, who seems to take his role as head of household seriously even in death. Visitors to the house's bar area, which was once the family's formal parlor, often report the feeling of being observed by a stern but benevolent presence. Thomas appears most commonly as a tall figure in Victorian-era clothing, often carrying what appears to be a newspaper and checking a pocket watch. What distinguishes Thomas's manifestations from typical ghostly encounters is his apparent awareness of current events and modern visitors. Rather than simply replaying scenes from his past, Thomas seems to be actively monitoring his property and assessing the people who enter his home. Visitors who show respect for the house and its history often report feeling welcomed by an invisible presence, while those who are disruptive or disrespectful sometimes find themselves escorted to the door by an unseen force. The bar area of the Whaley house is also frequented by the spirit of Anna Whaley, Thomas's wife, who died in the house in 1913 at the age of 80. Anna's presence is most commonly detected through the scent of her favorite perfume, a rose-based fragrance that was popular in the late 1800s, and through the sounds of domestic activity that seem to come from areas of the house that are currently unoccupied. Visitors to the bar often report hearing the sounds of someone setting a formal table in the adjacent dining room, complete with the clink of china and silverware being arranged with careful precision. When curious guests investigate these sounds, they find the dining room empty but notice that the table settings have often been rearranged in patterns that match formal dining protocols from the Victorian era. Anna's spirit seems particularly concerned with maintaining proper social etiquette within her home. Visitors who fail to observe basic politeness, such as removing hats indoors or speaking in respectful tones, often find themselves the target of supernatural disapproval. This disapproval manifests as sudden temperature drops, the feeling of being watched with displeasure, and in extreme cases, gentle but unmistakable physical contact, such as a tap on the shoulder or a tug on clothing. The Whaley house is also home to the spirit of Violet Whaley, Thomas and Anna's daughter, who committed suicide in the house in 1885 at the age of 22. Violet's tragic death, caused by an unhappy marriage and social pressures that overwhelmed her sensitive nature, seems to have bound her spirit to the house where she experienced both her happiest and most desperate moments. Violet's presence is most strongly felt in the upstairs area of the house, but she occasionally manifests in the bar area, particularly when young women are present. Unlike her parents, who maintain the dignified reserve typical of their generation, Violet's spirit seems to be seeking comfort and understanding from visitors who might relate to her emotional struggles. Young female visitors to the Whaley house frequently report feeling an immediate kinship with an unseen presence, as if someone their own age was trying to communicate with them. Some have reported hearing a soft female voice offering advice about relationships or expressing concern about their well-being. These communications are always gentle and supportive, suggesting that Violet's spirit has found peace despite her tragic end. But the Whaley house harbors a supernatural presence that predates the family entirely. The spirit of Yankee Jim Robinson, the thief who was executed on the property before the house was built, continues to manifest throughout the building. Unlike the Whaley family spirits, who seem content to maintain their domestic routines, Yankee Jim's presence carries an undercurrent of restlessness and unfinished business. Yankee Jim manifests most commonly through heavy footsteps heard throughout the house, particularly in the upstairs area where the floorboards creak under the weight of invisible feet. The footsteps follow no predictable pattern and seem to occur most frequently when the house is quiet and peaceful, as if Yankee Jim is deliberately announcing his presence to remind everyone that he has a claim to the property. The most unsettling aspect of Yankee Jim's manifestations is their unpredictability. While the Whaley family spirits follow patterns consistent with their personalities in life, Yankee Jim's supernatural behavior suggests a consciousness that operates by its own mysterious logic. Visitors sometimes report feeling watched by a presence that seems calculating and potentially hostile, though no visitor has ever been harmed by Yankee Jim's spirit. During a paranormal investigation in 2020, researchers attempted to communicate directly with Yankee Jim using period-appropriate language and showing respect for his grievances. The session, conducted in the bar area of the house, produced remarkable results that suggest Yankee Jim's spirit possesses a sophisticated understanding of both his historical situation and current events. Through electronic voice phenomena and other communication methods, Yankee Jim expressed awareness that he had been executed for a relatively minor crime and that his punishment was disproportionate to his offense. More remarkably, he demonstrated knowledge of changes in the legal system that have occurred since his death, suggesting that spirits may continue to learn and grow even after death. The supernatural activity at the Whaley house extends beyond individual spirits to encompass what researchers describe as psychic imprints of significant events that occurred within the building. The house seems to retain memories of important family gatherings, business transactions, and emotional moments that played out within its walls. Visitors with psychic sensitivity often report experiencing brief but vivid visions of past events, as if the house itself is sharing its memories with those who are receptive. These visions typically involve happy occasions such as Christmas celebrations, birthday parties, and family dinners, suggesting that the house has preserved its most positive memories along with its supernatural residents. The most remarkable aspect of the Whaley house hauntings is the apparent harmony between multiple spirits sharing the same space. Unlike locations where different ghosts seem to be in conflict or operating independently, the spirits of the Whaley house appear to have maintained their family dynamics and social relationships beyond death. This supernatural family unit suggests that human consciousness and personality survive death intact, complete with the ability to maintain complex relationships with other spirits. The Whaley house provides compelling evidence that what we call hauntings might actually be parallel communities of the deceased who continue to exist alongside the living world. But not all family spirits are as harmonious as the Whaleys, and our next destination will introduce us to a location where family dysfunction has created one of America's most disturbing supernatural environments. In the heart of historic Charleston, South Carolina, where Spanish moss drapes ancient oak trees like funeral shrouds and the very air seems thick with the weight of centuries, stands a theater that has been host to dramas far more intense than any ever performed on its stage. The Dock Street Theater, rebuilt on the site of America's first theater building, harbors supernatural residents whose performances began long before the curtain ever rose on opening night. The original Dock Street Theater, built in 1736, was destroyed by fire in the 1740s. In its place rose the Planters Hotel, an elegant establishment that catered to Charleston's wealthy plantation owners and their families during the antebellum period. The hotel operated successfully until the Civil War, when it became a refuge for Confederate officers and later, during Reconstruction, housed displaced families whose lives had been shattered by the conflict. In 1935, the building was restored and reopened as the Dock Street Theater, combining its historical legacy with a new purpose as a venue for live performances. But the restoration did more than simply create a new theater. It awakened supernatural residents who had been dormant for decades, spirits whose own dramatic stories now overshadow any production that takes place on the building's stage. The bar area of the Dock Street Theater, located in what was once the Planters Hotel's elegant lobby, is home to one of America's most documented supernatural residents. Nettie Dickerson, who worked as a prostitute operating from the hotel during the 1850s, met her death in a room on the second floor under circumstances that were never fully explained. Her spirit has remained in the building for over 170 years, and her presence in the theater bar has become legendary among both staff and patrons. Nettie manifests most commonly as a woman in her 30s wearing a red dress typical of the 1850s. Unlike many spirits who seem unaware of the living world, Nettie actively engages with visitors to the bar, particularly men who are alone or who show interest in the building's history. Her interactions are consistently described as flirtatious but melancholy, as if she's seeking connection while remaining eternally aware of her tragic fate. Bartender Marcus Williams has worked at the Dock Street Theater for 7 years and estimates that he encounters Nettie's spirit at least twice a week. According to Marcus, Nettie's manifestations follow predictable patterns that suggest she's maintaining the same routine she followed in life. She appears most frequently during evening hours, often positioning herself at the end of the bar where she can observe the entire room. Marcus describes Nettie as generally benevolent but occasionally possessive. Male patrons who sit in her preferred area of the bar often report feeling a hand on their shoulder or sensing someone sitting beside them when the adjacent stool is visibly empty. Some visitors have reported hearing a soft female voice offering to buy them a drink or asking about their personal lives. The most remarkable aspect of Nettie's manifestations is her apparent ability to affect the physical world. Bartenders regularly find glasses moved from where they left them, bar stools adjusted to different heights, and most frequently, drinks that appear to have been consumed despite no customer ordering or paying for them. Security cameras have captured footage of glasses sliding across the bar surface with no apparent cause, always moving toward the area where Nettie is most commonly sighted. But Nettie isn't the only supernatural resident of the Dock Street Theater bar. The spirit of a Confederate officer, identified through historical research as Captain Jonathan Hartwell, also frequents the bar area. Captain Hartwell was stationed in Charleston during the final months of the Civil War and was killed in the city's defense in February 1865. Captain Hartwell's manifestations are distinctly different from Nettie's flirtatious appearances. He manifests most commonly as a sense of military bearing and authority, often accompanied by the scent of tobacco and gunpowder. Visitors to the bar, particularly men, sometimes report feeling suddenly compelled to stand at attention or feeling judged by an invisible presence with high standards for behavior and deportment. The captain's spirit seems particularly concerned with maintaining proper conduct within the theater. Patrons who become overly intoxicated or disruptive often find their drinks mysteriously emptying or disappearing entirely. On several occasions, disruptive visitors have reported feeling a firm hand on their shoulder, followed by clear instruction to moderate their behavior or leave the premises. The interaction between Nettie and Captain Hartwell creates one of the most complex supernatural dynamics documented in American haunted locations. The two spirits seem to be aware of each other and engage in what can only be described as ongoing personality conflicts that have persisted for over a century and a half. Theater staff have observed patterns suggesting that the two spirits compete for attention from living visitors. When Nettie is actively manifesting her presence to male bar patrons, Captain Hartwell often responds by creating disturbances that redirect attention away from her. Conversely, when the captain is attempting to maintain order in the bar area, Nettie sometimes responds with increasingly dramatic supernatural displays. The most documented incident of supernatural conflict between the two spirits occurred during a private event in March 2019. A group of Civil War historians had rented the theater bar for a lecture and discussion about Charleston's role in the conflict. As the evening progressed, both Nettie and Captain Hartwell began manifesting simultaneously, each apparently trying to dominate the supernatural environment. The temperature in the bar area began fluctuating wildly, dropping suddenly in areas where the captain's presence was felt while remaining warm in areas associated with Nettie. Glasses began moving across the bar surface seemingly of their own accord, while chairs rearranged themselves into patterns that suggested different social configurations from different historical periods. The culmination of the supernatural conflict occurred when the guest lecturer, Dr. Amanda Foster, was physically touched by invisible hands while discussing the experiences of women during the Civil War. Dr. Foster reported feeling one hand gently placed on her arm, consistent with Nettie's typically gentle manifestations, while simultaneously feeling another hand firmly grasp her shoulder in what seemed to be a protective or possessive gesture. The dual manifestation created such a charged supernatural atmosphere that several guests left the event early, reporting feeling caught in the middle of an otherworldly dispute they couldn't fully understand. But the Dock Street Theater's supernatural complexity extends beyond the relationship between Nettie and Captain Hartwell. The building's history as both a theater and a hotel has created layers of supernatural residents representing different time periods and social classes. The theater stage area is haunted by what staff members have dubbed the actor, a male spirit who seems to be perpetually rehearsing or performing monologues from plays that were popular in the early 1800s. The actor manifests most commonly through disembodied voices heard throughout the theater, reciting lines from Shakespeare, Marlowe, and other classical dramatists. Unlike many theatrical ghosts who are said to be former performers seeking one final curtain call, the actor seems to be practicing rather than performing, as if he's preparing for an audition or debut that will never come. His recitations are often imperfect, with forgotten lines and false starts that suggest he was an aspiring performer rather than an established star. The hotel areas of the building are haunted by what appears to be an entire family of spirits from the Reconstruction era. These ghosts manifest as a group rather than as individuals, and their supernatural activities seem to center around domestic routines and family interactions that played out during their residence in the building during the 1870s. Visitors to the upper floors of the theater often report hearing conversations between multiple people, the sounds of children playing, and domestic activities such as meal preparation and household cleaning. These sounds always seem to be coming from areas of the building that are currently unoccupied, and investigations consistently find no physical source for the auditory phenomena. The family spirits seem particularly active during holidays and special occasions, as if they're continuing to observe celebrations and traditions that were important to them in life. During Christmas season, staff members report finding decorations moved or rearranged in patterns consistent with Victorian-era holiday traditions, despite the building being secured overnight. The most unsettling aspect of the Dock Street Theater hauntings is the apparent ability of the various spirits to coordinate their activities. Rather than operating as independent entities, the supernatural residents seem to function as a community, with different spirits taking turns manifesting while others remain dormant. This coordinated supernatural activity suggests a level of organization and communication between spirits that challenges conventional understanding of how hauntings operate. The Dock Street Theater appears to be home to an entire supernatural society, complete with social hierarchies, territorial disputes, and community traditions that continue to evolve even after death. But some hauntings are so intense, so overwhelming, that they consume everything around them. Our next destination will take us to a place where a single tragic event created supernatural phenomena so powerful that it changed the lives of everyone who encountered it. High in the Sierra Nevada mountains of California, at an elevation of over 8,000 feet, sits a town that time forgot and death never left. Bodie, once a booming gold mining town with a population of nearly 10,000, is now a ghost town in the most literal sense imaginable. The Saloon at Bodie, frozen in time since the town's abandonment in the 1940s, harbors supernatural residents whose stories are as wild and violent as the frontier town they refuse to leave. During its heyday in the 1870s and 1880s, Bodie was known as one of the most lawless towns in the American West. The combination of instant wealth from gold discoveries, isolation from civilized authority, and a population consisting largely of desperate men far from home created an environment where violence was as common as whiskey and gunfights were settled as quickly as poker disputes. The Saloon at Bodie witnessed more murders per capita than perhaps any drinking establishment in American history. In just 10 years of operation, over 30 documented killings took place within its walls, not counting the countless fights, knifings, and shootouts that occurred in the surrounding area. When the gold ran out and the population dwindled, those who died violently in Bodie seemed to have made a collective decision to stay behind. What makes the supernatural activity at Bodie's Saloon unique is its scale and intensity. This isn't a location with one or two notable spirits, but rather an entire supernatural community of dozens of entities whose presence has been documented by visitors, park rangers, and paranormal investigators for over 70 years. The most frequently encountered spirit in the Saloon is known simply as Black Bart, though historical research suggests this may not have been his real name. Black Bart was a professional gambler who was shot and killed during a card game in 1879 when he was caught cheating. His death was particularly brutal, and witnesses reported that he continued trying to play his hand even as he lay dying on the saloon floor. Black Bart's spirit seems to be eternally focused on that final, fatal card game. Visitors to the saloon often report finding playing cards scattered across the floor, arranged in poker hands that would have been winning combinations. The cards appear to be period appropriate, printed in styles that match those used in the 1870s, though no one can explain where they come from or how they appear in a building that has been secured and monitored by the California State Park System for decades. The supernatural gambling at Bodie's Saloon extends beyond scattered cards to include the sounds of active gaming. Park rangers conducting security checks often report hearing the distinct sounds of poker chips being shuffled, cards being dealt, and multiple voices engaged in the kind of tense conversation that accompanies high-stakes gambling. These phantom poker games seem to follow a predictable schedule, beginning around 10 p.m. and continuing until the early morning hours. The games appear to be most active during the winter months, when the town is buried under several feet of snow and completely isolated from the outside world. Park Ranger Jennifer Martinez, who has worked at Bodie State Historic Park for 12 years, describes the phantom gambling as both fascinating and deeply unsettling. According to Jennifer, the supernatural poker games often seem to be building toward the same violent conclusion that ended Black Bart's life, creating an atmosphere of mounting tension that can be felt throughout the saloon. On several occasions, Jennifer has heard the sounds of chairs being overturned and angry voices raised in accusation, followed by what sounds like a gunshot. These phantom recreations of Black Bart's murder always end in complete silence, as if the supernatural participants are reset to begin the same tragic sequence again. But Black Bart isn't the only supernatural gambler eternally playing cards in Bodie's Saloon. The building is also home to the spirit of a woman known as Gold Rush Kate, a professional gambler and saloon owner who was murdered in 1881 by a customer who claimed she had cheated him out of his life savings. Kate's spirit manifests differently from Black Bart's focus on poker. She seems to be concerned with the business aspects of running a saloon, often appearing as a figure in Victorian-era dress who seems to be taking inventory of bottles and supplies that no longer exist. Visitors to the saloon sometimes report seeing a woman in period clothing moving behind the bar, apparently cleaning glasses and arranging bottles. What makes Kate's manifestations particularly remarkable is her apparent awareness of modern visitors. Unlike Black Bart, who seems trapped in an endless loop of his final card game, Kate appears to notice and interact with living people who enter her establishment. Several visitors have reported being approached by Kate's spirit and feeling welcomed into what she apparently still considers to be her saloon. These interactions are described as warm and hospitable, with visitors reporting the sensation of being offered drinks by an invisible hostess who takes pride in maintaining proper customer service standards. The supernatural activity at Bodie's Saloon intensifies dramatically during the winter months, when the town is completely isolated by snow and accessible only by snowmobile or cross-country skiing. Park rangers who maintain the site during winter report paranormal phenomena, so intense that many refuse to work alone in the saloon area. During a particularly severe winter storm in February 2020, Park Ranger David Chun was trapped in Bodie for 3 days when an unexpected blizzard made evacuation impossible. His experience during those isolated days provides insight into the full extent of the supernatural activity that occurs when the saloon is completely cut off from the living world. According to David's official report, filed with the California State Park System, the phantom gambling activities intensified dramatically on the first night of his isolation. Rather than just hearing the sounds of poker games, David reported seeing full apparitions of men in 1870s clothing engaged in active card games throughout the saloon. The spirits appeared to be completely unaware of David's presence, focused entirely on their eternal gaming. He watched as spectral cards were dealt, Bets were placed with phantom money, and tensions rose exactly as they would have during the saloon's operational years. Most remarkably, David reported that the supernatural poker games seemed to be following actual historical events. The conversations he overheard, the disputes that arose, and even the specific hands being played matched accounts of actual incidents that had been documented in local newspapers from the 1870s and 1880s. On the second night of his isolation, David witnessed what he believes was the supernatural recreation of Black Bart's murder. The phantom poker game built to its familiar climax, with accusations of cheating leading to the sound of gunfire. But this time, David saw the entire sequence play out in visual form, watching as the spirit of Black Bart was shot down in exactly the same location where his body had been found 140 years earlier. The most unsettling aspect of David's experience was the realization that the supernatural residents of Bodie's saloon seemed to exist in multiple time periods simultaneously. While Black Bart and his fellow gamblers were recreating events from the 1870s, other spirits appeared to be experiencing different time periods, creating a supernatural environment where past, present, and future seemed to exist side by side. But Bodie's supernatural phenomena extend beyond the saloon to encompass the entire town. The combination of sudden wealth, violent death, and mass abandonment has created what paranormal researchers describe as a complete supernatural ecosystem where an entire community of the dead continues to exist parallel to our world. The residential areas of Bodie are haunted by the spirits of families who lived and died during the town's boom years. These domestic ghosts seem to be maintaining their daily routines despite the fact that their town has been abandoned for decades. Park rangers report seeing lights in windows of buildings that have no electricity, smoke rising from chimneys that haven't been used in over 70 years, and the sounds of children playing in streets where no living children have walked for generations. What makes Bodie unique among America's ghost towns is the completeness of its supernatural preservation. This isn't just a location where individual spirits linger, but rather an entire community that seems to have collectively refused to accept its own demise. The supernatural residents of Bodie appear to be living full afterlives, complete with social interactions, business relationships, and community activities that mirror what existed during the town's living years. During full moon periods, when visibility is highest in the isolated mountain location, visitors have reported seeing what appears to be an entire phantom town existing alongside the preserved historical buildings. Ghostly figures move through the streets, engaging in conversations and activities that suggest a thriving community invisible to most living observers. The saloon serves as the social center for this supernatural community, just as it did when Bodie was a living town. The eternal poker games that play out within its walls aren't just repetitions of past events, but rather ongoing social activities that continue to bring the town's ghostly residents together night after night, year after year, decade after decade. This realization raises profound questions about the nature of consciousness after death and whether some locations become so saturated with human experience that they create permanent bridges between the world of the living and the world of the dead. Bodie's Saloon may be more than just a haunted building. It may be a window into an afterlife where human consciousness continues to exist in familiar patterns and social structures. But as overwhelming as Bodie's supernatural community may be, our final destination will take us to a place where a single malevolent entity has created a reign of terror that continues to this day. Our journey through America's most haunted bars concludes in Savannah, Georgia, a city where the living and the dead have coexisted for centuries in an uneasy truce that occasionally erupts into supernatural warfare. The Kehoe House, an elegant Victorian mansion that now operates as a boutique hotel with an intimate bar, harbors a presence so malevolent, so actively hostile to the living, that it has driven guests to flee in the middle of the night and employees to quit without notice. Built in 1892 by William Kehoe, a successful iron foundry owner, The mansion was designed to showcase the family's wealth and social position in Savannah's elite society. The house's elaborate ironwork, crafted in Kehoe's own foundry, created an atmosphere of Gothic elegance that was both beautiful and slightly ominous. But the true darkness in the Kehoe house didn't emerge until tragedy struck the family in ways that would forever stain the building's history. The Kehoe family experienced a series of deaths that were unusual even by the standards of the late 1800s, when childhood mortality was tragically common. Between 1890 and 1900, the family lost 7 children to various illnesses, accidents, and mysterious circumstances that were never fully explained. The deaths occurred throughout the house, but several took place in what is now the building's intimate bar area, which was then the family's formal parlor. What makes the supernatural activity at the Kehoe house different from the other haunted locations we visited is the presence of what paranormal investigators describe as an actively malevolent entity. While the other bars we've explored are haunted by human spirits who retain recognizable personalities and motivations, the Kehoe house is dominated by something that seems to feed on fear, suffering, and negative emotions. The malevolent presence in the Kehoe house doesn't seem to be the spirit of any individual who lived or died in the building. Instead, it appears to be something that was drawn to the location by the accumulated grief and trauma of the multiple child deaths, growing stronger over the decades as it fed on the pain of successive visitors and residents. Hotel guests who stay in rooms near the bar area regularly report nightmares so vivid and disturbing that they wake up screaming. These aren't ordinary bad dreams, but rather experiences that seem designed to target each individual's deepest fears and psychological vulnerabilities. The nightmares often involve the dreamer being trapped in the Kehoe house while invisible forces hunt them through the building's maze-like corridors. What makes these experiences particularly disturbing is their consistency across different guests who have no knowledge of each other's experiences. Independent visitors report remarkably similar nightmare scenarios, suggesting that they're not just experiencing random psychological phenomena, but rather being subjected to some form of supernatural psychological assault. The bar area of the Kehoe house serves as the epicenter for the malevolent entity's activities. Patrons enjoying evening cocktails often report feeling watched by something that radiates hostility and malicious intent. Unlike the spirits at other locations who seem curious about or indifferent to the living, the presence at the Kehoe house seems to actively despise anyone who enters its domain. Bartender Michael Santos worked at the Kehoe house for exactly 11 days before quitting without notice, leaving behind 2 weeks' pay and refusing to explain his departure to management. 6 months later, he agreed to discuss his experiences on condition that his current location not be revealed. According to Michael, the malevolent presence in the bar made its hostility known from his first day of work. Glasses would shatter in his hands for no apparent reason, always resulting in cuts to his fingers and hands. Bottles of expensive liquor would fall from secure shelves, creating messes that took hours to clean and financial losses that came out of his paycheck. But the physical harassment was nothing compared to the psychological torment. Michael reported feeling constantly watched by something that seemed to be studying his movements, learning his routines, and planning some form of attack. The sensation was so intense that he found himself unable to concentrate on his work, constantly looking over his shoulder and jumping at every sound. The harassment escalated on Michael's final night of work. As he was closing the bar at the end of his shift, every glass in the establishment simultaneously shattered, creating a cacophony of breaking crystal that brought hotel security running. But the destruction went beyond random breakage. The glass fragments had arranged themselves in patterns on the floor, forming what appeared to be symbols or letters that spelled out a single word: leave. The malevolent presence at the Kehoe house seems particularly hostile toward women, with female guests and employees experiencing more severe supernatural harassment than their male counterparts. Women staying in rooms above the bar area report being physically touched by invisible hands, having their hair pulled while they sleep, and waking to find their personal belongings rearranged in disturbing patterns. One of the most documented incidents occurred in October 2021, when a female guest named Patricia Williams was staying in a room directly above the bar. Patricia, a travel writer researching historic hotels for a guidebook, initially dismissed reports of supernatural activity as marketing gimmicks designed to attract tourists. Her skepticism vanished on her second night when she was awakened by the sensation of someone sitting on her bed. The mattress compressed under invisible weight, and she could feel the presence of someone or something leaning over her. When she reached for the bedside lamp, her hand was violently slapped away by an unseen force, leaving red marks on her wrist that lasted for days. Patricia attempted to flee the room but found that the door, which she had left unlocked, was now secured by some invisible mechanism. No amount of turning the handle or pulling on the door could open it. She was trapped in the room with a presence that seemed to be feeding on her terror. The psychological assault that followed was unlike anything Patricia had ever experienced. She began seeing visions of children in Victorian-era clothing standing around her bed. But these weren't the innocent spirits one might expect from child ghosts. These apparitions radiated malevolence, their faces twisted into expressions of hatred, and their eyes reflecting an intelligence that was both childlike and ancient. The visions lasted until dawn, when the door suddenly opened on its own, allowing Patricia to flee the building. She never completed her guidebook research and has refused to discuss the Kehoe house in any professional capacity since her experience. But the malevolent presence at the Kehoe house isn't content to limit its activities to guests and employees. The entity seems to be actively spreading its influence beyond the building itself, affecting people who visit the bar area and then carry some form of supernatural contamination with them when they leave. Several former patrons of the Kehoe House Bar have reported experiencing supernatural harassment in their own homes weeks or months after visiting the establishment. These experiences typically begin with nightmares similar to those experienced by hotel guests, but escalate to include physical manifestations such as objects moving on their own, unexplained sounds, and the sensation of being watched in familiar environments. Dr. Sarah Chun, a psychiatrist who specializes in trauma-related disorders, visited the Kehoe House Bar in 2019 as part of a research project on the psychological effects of allegedly haunted locations. Dr. Chun, a committed skeptic who approached the investigation from a purely scientific perspective, experienced phenomena that challenged her understanding of both psychology and reality. According to Dr. Chen's research notes, she began experiencing unusual symptoms within minutes of entering the bar area. Despite having no history of anxiety disorders, she felt overwhelming dread and panic that had no rational source. Her heart rate elevated, her hands began shaking, and she experienced difficulty breathing despite being in excellent physical health. Most significantly, Dr. Chun began experiencing what she described as intrusive thoughts that didn't seem to originate from her own consciousness. These thoughts were uniformly negative and seemed designed to exploit her professional insecurities and personal fears. She found herself thinking about patient failures, questioning her competence as a therapist, and experiencing guilt about cases from years earlier that she had successfully resolved. The psychological assault was so intense that Dr. Chun left the building after less than 30 minutes, abandoning her research equipment and driving directly home. The intrusive thoughts continued for several days, gradually diminishing but leaving her with a profound sense of having been violated by some external intelligence. Dr. Chen's experience suggests that the malevolent presence at the Kehoe house possesses a sophisticated understanding of human psychology and the ability to manipulate thoughts and emotions in ways that go far beyond simple fear tactics. The entity seems capable of accessing personal memories and using them as weapons against its victims. The supernatural activity at the Kehoe house has intensified significantly in recent years, leading some paranormal investigators to theorize that the malevolent entity is growing stronger by feeding on the fear and negative emotions of its victims. Each successful harassment campaign seems to increase the entity's power and expand its ability to affect the living world. Hotel management has attempted various interventions to address the supernatural activity, including religious blessings, paranormal cleansings, and even temporarily closing the bar area during periods of intense activity. None of these efforts have had any lasting effect, and some have seemed to make the harassment worse, as if the entity views attempts to remove it as declarations of war. The most disturbing aspect of the Kehoe house haunting is its apparent intelligence and adaptability. Unlike the spirits at other locations who seem to be replaying past events or maintaining familiar routines, the malevolent presence at the Kehoe house appears to be actively learning, growing, and developing new methods of psychological and physical harassment. This evolution suggests that we may be dealing with something far more dangerous than a traditional haunting. The entity at the Kehoe house may represent a form of supernatural predator that has learned to hunt human consciousness itself, feeding on fear and trauma while growing stronger with each successful attack. As our journey through America's most haunted bars comes to an end, we're left with the unsettling realization that the line between the living and the dead may be far thinner than we ever imagined. These 10 locations represent more than just tourist attractions or curiosities for thrill seekers. They're active supernatural environments where human consciousness continues to exist in forms that challenge our most basic assumptions about life, death, and the nature of reality itself. From the genteel colonial spirits of the White Horse Tavern to the malevolent entity that stalks the Kehoe house, we've encountered evidence that death may not be the ending we've always believed it to be. Instead, it may simply be a transition to a different form of existence, one where human consciousness adapts to new realities while maintaining the essential characteristics that defined us in life. The spirits we've encountered aren't just echoes of the past. They're active participants in an ongoing drama that spans centuries, carrying forward the loves, hatreds, ambitions, and fears that drove them during their mortal lives. Some, like the Whaley family, have found peace in their supernatural existence. Others, like the entity at the Kehoe house, have become something far darker and more dangerous than they ever were in life. These haunted bars serve as more than just locations for supernatural encounters. They're laboratories where we can study the persistence of human consciousness beyond death, windows into parallel worlds where the dead continue to exist alongside the living, and warnings about the power of human emotion to transcend even the ultimate boundary of mortality. The next time you raise a glass in a bar with a long history, take a moment to consider who might be drinking alongside you. The spirits who frequent these establishments have stories to tell, lessons to share, and warnings to give. They're not just remnants of the past, but active participants in an ongoing conversation between the world of the living and the world of the dead. And if you've been captivated by these stories of America's most haunted bars, you won't want to miss our next exploration into the supernatural. Click on the end screen now to discover the 10 most haunted places in America, where we'll take you beyond drinking establishments to explore haunted hospitals, schools, prisons, and private homes where the dead refuse to rest. From the ghostly patients still walking the halls of abandoned asylums to the spectral children playing in the ruins of forgotten schools, these locations will challenge everything you thought you knew about life after death. The journey into America's supernatural landscape is just beginning, and the spirits are waiting to share their secrets with those brave enough to listen. Sweet dreams, and remember, in the world of the paranormal, closing time never really comes.